Queen Alicent has not forgotten the love you once had for each other. No blood need be spilled.
Hey guys, Pete here. Today I'll be talking about the final episode of House of the Dragon's first season. It was titled The Black Queen, though Dragon's Gonna Dragon might have been more fitting. A few weeks ago after Viserys passed, I read an excerpt from Fire and Blood where I had to leave out the last sentence because it described what was coming at the end of the season. Now that we're here, let's revisit that. It reads, "Then Viserys of House Targaryen, the first of his name, king of the Andals, the Rhaenyra, and the First Men, lord of the Seven Kingdoms and protector of the realm, closed his eyes and went to sleep. He never woke. He was 52 years old and had reigned over most of Westeros for 26 years. Then the storm broke and the dragons danced." If you're thinking, I don't know if I would call what we saw happen to Luke at the end of this episode a dance, you're not alone. Archmaester Gildane, the fictional character who wrote the Targaryen histories, described it like this: "To characterize the dark, turbulent, bloody doings of this period as a dance strikes us as grotesquely inappropriate. No doubt the phrase originated with some singer." Most of Season 1 functioned as a prologue to establish the characters who will be at the center of that dance, and lay out the events that made it inevitable. Those events are all tied to King Viserys I's reign. He ascended the Iron Throne at the height of House Targaryen's power in a long period of peace and prosperity. He was an indecisive but mostly likable character that perhaps tried too hard to hold on to that peace. We came to understand that Viserys lived a life defined by guilt and remorse over the death of his first wife, Aemma, and how his obsession with prophecy was connected to that and the decisions that he made as king. More importantly, we meet his daughter and named heir Rhaenyra, and her childhood friend and daughter of the Hand of the King, Alicent Hightower. We're first introduced to them when they're about the same age as Luke is when he takes his fateful flight to Storm's End. We see the bond that they had back then and watch them grow up, and then see how they were positioned to be at odds with each other after his death. In the finale, we had a great reminder of their connection in the form of a torn-out page from a history book. It's a heartfelt gesture that makes you wonder if things could be different, while at the same time, it's a tool being used in an attempt to manipulate a situation. It's fascinating, and it is something that I'll come back around to at the very end of the video. The final 2 episodes of the season go together and focus on the 2 different parties vying for power in the wake of Viserys' death. In episode 9, we saw how Alicent responded to what she believed was her husband's dying wish to see their son Aegon ascend the Iron Throne. In a showdown at Dragonstone that mirrors the one that Rhaenyra had 20 years prior with Daemon, Otto lays out what they hope to achieve by acting before she found out about her father's death. Coming into the finale, Aegon Targaryen II sits on the Iron Throne. He wears the Conqueror's crown, wields the Conqueror's sword, has the Conqueror's name, and he was anointed by a septon of the faith before the eyes of thousands. This reminds me of Varys' conversation with Tyrion in the original series where he tells him, "Power resides where men believe it resides. It's a trick, a shadow on a wall." And from the capital, in a seat that was forged from the swords of his house's fallen enemies, even an unfit young mess of a man can cast a very large shadow. Alicent's faction, whom I'll be referring to as the Greens, has put Rhaenyra's faction, whom I'll be referring to as the Blacks, on their back foot. And the other thing Season 1 of this adaptation did was establish that the whole situation is somewhat more complicated than readers of the book may have thought it was. Fire and Blood is written as a fictional history. It retells the events of this period of time years after they happened, based on conflicting accounts from unreliable chroniclers. It's essentially propaganda filtered through their perspectives, and the show sets out to paint a more complete picture of what happened. Is this story about 2 obscenely entitled people fighting over how big of a piece of the pie they get? Is it about the insidious misogyny that affects them even in their rarefied stations? Is it about the real power behind them that props them up and uses them as puppets? Is it about protecting your family and your legacy? Is it a tragic tale that shows us that all this happened because of an ill-timed misunderstanding? Or is it a complicated mess made up of bits and pieces of all those things? The source material leaves this open for interpretation, and the show seems to be leaning towards it being all of the above. The finale opens with Rhaenyra's second son Lucerys Velaryon looking at the island of Driftmark on the painted table at Dragonstone. This is something fans of the original series will recognize, and Luke's problem here is that he's concerned he isn't up to the task that his duty and birthright demands if Lord Corlys doesn't recover from his injuries. This scene connects with the conversation he had with his grandsire back in episode 7, when he said he didn't want to be his heir because if he were the Lord of Driftmark, that would mean everyone else was dead. That episode set up a lot of what comes to a head in this final one. It highlighted the generational nature of how these families cling to power, how the parents count on their children to continue their legacies, and how they use them in their plotting with little regard to how it might affect them. This was also when Aemon traded his eye for the largest dragon in the world, and when things moved past what felt like a point of no return between Rhaenyra and Alicent. When Luke confesses that he doesn't think he has what it takes to be the Lord of the Tides, his mother tells him that we don't get to choose our destiny, and that she wasn't ready to be the Queen of the Seven Kingdoms when she was named heir at his age either. As she reassures him that she'll help him grow into that role, Rhaenys arrives fresh off her escape from King's Landing. She brings her the double dose of bad news that not only has her father died, but her half-brother has been crowned king. Initially, Rhaenys isn't there to get involved. She even clarifies why she didn't act in the dragon pit, saying it wasn't her war to start. Because relations seem to be improving between Rhaenyra and Alicent on her recent visit, this all does come as a genuine surprise. Daemon comes to the conclusion that the Greens killed his brother and usurped his wife's claim. Rhaenyra can't believe that Alicent asked Rhaenys to bend the knee to Aegon, and the stress of all that's happening sends her into labor, which is concerning to the Maester because it's very premature. And while she struggles through the pain of that, Daemon goes into military mode with the other concerned parties that are gathered there. Jace and Luke are in the middle of a training session, and it stands out that Jace is pretty hard on his younger brother, which may end up weighing on him down the road considering how things turn out. They get called inside to learn about everything that's happening, and you can see that they want to do their part. Daemon hears his wife calling out for him, but opts to continue planning. He also stares down Sir Laurent when he asks if he wants to go speak to the Maester to check on her. When Jace comes in to tell him that Rhaenyra doesn't want anyone to act while she's abed, he takes him outside to watch him give the two members of the Kingsguard a chance to swear their loyalty to their side. This is a tricky situation for them that is made all the more uncomfortable by the fact that Caraxes is standing right behind him. As Sir Steffan Darklyn points out, he first swore his oath to Jaehaerys, and then again for Viserys when he ascended. In that role, they were assigned to his daughter, who they know he named as his heir. That means that if they side with Rhaenyra, they'll be considered traitors by the people who are currently holding King's Landing. It's a great way to underline the way this succession crisis affects everyone, and goes hand in hand with Rhaenys killing a bunch of small folk as she was escaping the dragon pit. As sworn swords, these two could lose their lives right here or later if they find themselves on the losing side of things, as could all of the families that are standing around the table with Daemon. There are inherent benefits that sway the lords to one side or the other, and there are real risks if they end up on the losing side. These are the stakes, and even though Alicent does offer Rhaenyra terms that would let her keep Dragonstone and pass it down through her line, where Luke would get to fulfill his role as the Lord of the Tides, and her other children would be incorporated into Aegon II's court, she would find herself in the same situation Alicent was in before. Her children would never truly be safe as potential replacements for the current king. The moment he did something to turn powerful lords against him, which to be fair seems to be inevitable given his background, there would be calls to remove him. I do think Alicent is sincere in thinking this is a workable solution. I think sending the page from the book book she's kept for all those years reinforces that, but she's blinded to the reality of how people will react now that the shoe is on the other foot. And as I mentioned at the beginning, this is a calculated political move. Rhaenyra fights her way through a brutal stillbirth delivery. We see her take this on almost completely by herself, which is in direct contrast to what we watched Emma endure in episode 1, where the choice of how to proceed with her complications was taken away from her. Watching Rhaenyra lose what would have been her 6th child and first daughter evokes the conversation she had with her mother, where she explained that the birthing bed was their battlefield. This is a gripping sequence with another powerful performance by Emma Darcy that's topped off with a heart-wrenching scene of her preparing the body for burning herself. As they say goodbye, Sir Eric arrives to pledge himself to her cause. He presents her with Viserys' crown that he managed to get out of King's Landing. Daemon crowns her as Queen Rhaenyra, first of her name, and everyone present bends the knee to her except for Princess Rhaenys, who we'll find out later is waiting to see how her husband reacts to everything he missed out on. When she returns to the painted table to assume her role and lead, we get an idea of what the Blacks are up against. They do have a small force that is sufficient enough to defend Dragonstone, which is well fortified, but isn't enough to mount an invasion. The fact that Rhaenyra is interested in exploring other options enrages Daemon, who wants to make the Hightowers pay immediately. By his math, they have more dragons than the Greens, and they should use that advantage to take back the throne. Rhaenyra responds by citing some history that came down from her father in relation to old Valyria. When dragons flew to war, everything burned. I do not wish to rule over a kingdom of ash and bone. And while this is another blow to Daemon, who is having a hard time holding back, it does win over Princess Rhaenys, who is impressed with her restraint, and will lead to her bringing the Sea Snake on board for Team Black. And she had to bring him out of retirement to do that. After his injury, and after she lets him have it for abandoning his family for 6 years to go play at war after they lost Laena and Laenor, he was ready to enter his sunset phase and live out his days playing with their grandkids. She reminds him that they are all caught up in what's happening, and I guess we're supposed to understand that after she heard both pitches from Alicent in episode 9 and Rhaenyra here, she likes the idea of not ruling over ashes more than gently guiding the men who rule from the sidelines. To skip ahead briefly, when Corlys arrives, it's a huge boost because he brings with him the largest fleet in the world, and news that he managed to really conquer the Stepstones this time, which I imagine would cause Viserys to turn over in his grave if he had been buried rather than cremated by dragon. But this is all to say that they could shut down the waters around the capital to blockade King's Landing. Daemon has plans to take Harrenhal so that he can set up a base of operations on the continent, and we know that the lord of that castle now is Larys Strong, who spends most of his time in King's Landing. Corlys points out that this would make for a good start, but doesn't add up to a force that could win a war yet. It says in the book that even if you combined all the hosts of all the houses that are already pledged to their side, they still wouldn't be able to match the power the Hightowers alone could field. This is why the idea of pledging banners is so important in Westeros. All of these lords have their own armies, so their support matters. Plus, the Greens have control over the largest and richest cities in the realm in Old Town, King's Landing, and Lannisport. If it comes down to war, Rhaenyra will need to ensure the backing of several of the other major houses that bent the knee to her when she was named heir. The plan is for Jace to fly north, stopping first in the Eyrie, and then on to meet with the Starks at Winterfell. Luke will take the shorter and presumably safer trip to Storm's End, where his mother believes he will receive a warm welcome. She has them swear on a copy of the Seven-Pointed Star that they'll go as envoys rather than warriors, and won't take part in any fighting. And it really feels like an ominous sign when he calls her mother before correcting himself and saying, "Your Grace." Before we get into what happens, I want to just briefly recap how the two sides stack up at the end of the first season. The Greens have a king who sits on the Iron Throne that was crowned in front of tens of thousands of people. At his coronation, hundreds, if not thousands of small folk were killed by a dragon whose rider has now joined the other team. Even though Alicent believes she's acting in accordance with her husband's dying wishes, no one else believes that, including Aegon's staunchest supporters. They are usurpers, but they're counting on people preferring the male heir and overlooking their transgressions. They hold the capital, control the biggest cities with some of the richest families, and also have control of the royal treasury, which they split up and hid for safekeeping. They have the Dowager Queen, the mother of the king's first male heir, and her father who served as hand of the king for the last two Targaryen rulers. They have the largest dragon in the world in Vhagar, and two other adults with riders in Sunfire and Dreamfire, who are ridden by Aegon and Helaena. The Blacks have a well-fortified position at Dragonstone. They have the world's most powerful navy and the richest family in Westeros on their side. Rhaenyra was her father's named heir, but there are plenty of people who would refute that claim based on the fact that she's a woman. Going into this episode, they had at least 5 adult dragons with riders, since the show hasn't mentioned if Baela has started to ride Moondancer yet. Rhaenyra has Syrax, Daemon has Caraxes, Rhaenys has Meleys, Jace has Vermax, and Luke has Arax. There are also several riderless dragons that live in and around the Dragon Mount on Dragonstone. In this episode, we watched as Daemon paid a visit and sang a song in High Valyrian to Vermithor, which is the largest living dragon after Vhagar. Although as far as we know, this doesn't really change anything until they have someone to ride them. Vermithor was King Jaehaerys' mount. His wife Queen Alysanne's dragon, Silverwing, is also there, and Laenor's dragon, Seasmoke, but it's not clear if another rider can claim that one since their rider isn't really dead. There are also more unclaimed dragons that have never had riders that they know of. Of course, having a mountain full of dragons is not the same as having a stable full of horses. Not just anyone can claim them. Rhaena and the really small kids are the only ones in the family who don't already have one, and as we'll find out at Storm's End, going to war on dragons involves putting their children at risk. So about that, this final sequence started out looking fantastic, with Rhaenys riding to patrol the Gullet, Jace flying north, and little Luke heading south. Having the mature dragon there to emphasize how small Arax still is sets the stage, and then after he lands, it's downright frightening when you get the reveal that Vhagar is already there and let that size difference set in. The Greens have gotten to Boros Baratheon first, and Aemon was available to marry one of his daughters to form a marriage pact. The call for his family to remember the oath his father made falls on deaf ears. And while I think they did show that Rhaenyra did a more than capable job leading through most of what happened, a lot about this trip to Storm's End feels like it could have been planned better. Because he's an inexperienced kid, Luke just looks dejected and turns to leave. Aemon takes this as an opportunity to try to even the score for the eye that Luke took from him and demands that he cuts out one of his. He takes off his eye patch to reveal this giant sapphire he wears in his eye socket for extra style points, and unsurprisingly, Luke refuses his demand. Lord Boros also doesn't want to see this prince-on-prince violence under his roof. This is something that would be frowned upon because they are his guests, so he tells them to take it outside, basically. At this point, the storm is raging. Luke tries to calm Arax as much as he can before they take off, but I think we should keep in mind that he is completely afraid, as anyone would be in his position. And according to the lore, it's believed that dragons are able to sense their riders' emotions. The way this scene plays out is somewhat different than how I interpreted it from the book. In that telling, Aemon is provoked when one of the Baratheon daughters, who he didn't pick, questions his masculinity by asking if Luke took one of his eyes or one of his balls after he leaves. He storms out right after that, and then no one knows what happened other than the dragons were fighting in the sky and that Luke died as a result. He goes back to King's Landing and matter-of-factly states that he killed him, and that makes Aemon seem like a kinslaying psycho. Here he just seems to be trying to terrorize him. He may have wanted to take his eye, but it's clear that he doesn't want to kill him right before it happens. The problem is that on some level, Viserys was right when he said the idea that they control the dragons is an illusion. They're a power that man should have never trifled with, one that brought Valyria its doom. They're magical and majestic creatures, but they're also powerful weapons. We're reminded here that they have minds of their own, and they can't always be controlled. I made a comment about how much I liked that Viserys quote in my episode 1 video, and the one from Rhaenyra that preceded it where she says, "Everyone says Targaryens are closer to gods than to men, but they say that because of our dragons. Without them, we're just like everyone else." All of these characters grew up in a time where their power as a family stood unopposed for that reason. It's what King Jaehaerys knew and why he called the Great Council of 101 AC to let the Lords of the Seven Kingdoms decide on his contested succession. And it's at the end of that opening flashback where we get that other key line saying that the only thing that could tear down the House of the Dragon was itself. When both sides of a conflict have dragons, the stakes are redefined. The way things play out here is that Aerax appears to get scared and tries to burn Vhagar. She responds in kind, biting the much smaller dragon in two, and as far as I can tell, swallows Luke whole in the process. As mentioned, you can tell by his reaction that this is not what Aemon intended. It's still his fault for chasing after him in the first place, but the idea that things got out of control adds a layer to the situation. What's interesting is that if he were to tell the truth about what happened, he'd have to admit that he can't control his dragon. It makes me wonder if he might not lie in order to keep that a secret. Is it better to be a kinslayer who showed their enemies they're not to be messed with, or to be someone who can't be trusted to take their dragon into battle? I mean, we are talking about a young man, a second son no less, that's out to prove himself, so I guess we'll have to wait until season 2 to find out how he handles that. Either way, it makes him a more complex character than if he just rage murdered his nephew over something that happened when they were kids. One thing that's certain is that Luke's death changes everything. In the book it says, "And with his death, the war of ravens and envoys and marriage pacts came to an end, and the war of fire and blood began in earnest." The episode and season end with a scene that starts in silence. Daemon approaches the painted table in slow motion. The shot tracks him from behind as he makes his way from the door over to Rhaenyra's side. We can't see his face, but she can, and it looks like she picks up on something before he opens his mouth. They turn toward the fireplace, and we see that what he tells her shakes her off her balance, causing her to stumble. In the end, she turns, and Emma Darcy delivers a face that tells us that everything will change for this character from this moment on. An indiscriminate mix of pain and anger and loss and rage, and then it cuts to black. I really enjoyed this finale. It's up there with the other top episodes I thought stood out from what turned out to be a pretty solid introductory season overall. Going in, episodes 4, 7, and 8 were my favorites, and I would put this right there next to them. I still think the performances, the costuming, and the production design are the foundation of why this show works as well as it does. The painted table lit from below was a great looking addition, and getting a better look at Storm's End has me excited to visit other Westerosi locations as this conflict gets bigger. This was Emma Darcy's episode, much in the same way that episode 9 was Olivia Cook's, and they delivered a memorable performance of Rhaenyra that required such a wide range of emotions to be packed into this one single hour. She lost her father, she lost her claim, she lost an unborn child, only to be crowned by her husband, who later chokes her out, and then she loses another child by the end of the episode. And I think you can see that war lives in that look that she delivered at the end there, and how all of those things conspired to bring her to that place. The other performance that was surprising was the young man who played Luke, Elliot Grihal. I thought he did a terrific job in all of his key scenes. I mentioned before that I don't pay that much attention to the CGI. As long as it doesn't take away from everything else that's happening, I'm pretty okay with it. And I think the show has done that pretty effectively throughout this season, but I have to say that this episode is on a different level. All of the shots of Vhagar in the clouds and when they clear the storm looked amazing. And the detail of how Aerax was responding to the situation and to Luke really seemed spot on. They even managed to make Aemon's sapphire fire cool, which was something I wasn't expecting. I've been mixed on some of the choices they made in this first season, but didn't feel like any of them undermined the strengths of the story. Having seen the whole season now, I think I'd like the change with Aemon the most, if you'd even call it a change, because in world, the only person who really knows what happened is Aemon. I can understand a knee-jerk reaction to this not matching up with who you thought the character was. I do experience that whenever they change things from the book when I'm watching, or if it makes it a little less convenient to hate the Greens if that's what you're into. But I think if you think it through, it makes the character more interesting. It gives them more options on what they can do with him, and it doesn't really change the larger story. It still starts the war, and it highlights how when things start moving in that direction, they're nearly impossible to stop. No one's actions are without consequences here, including Aemon, and he's just out there acting on behalf of his family. Plus, the dragons being out of their control does seem like a foundational element to the whole thing with their family. The reason they have their power is because of those creatures. And you think about the corruptible nature of power when it comes to something like becoming a king, but think about giving a small selection of teenagers dragons and what that might do to them. Another thing I liked about this episode was that there was a lot of facial acting going on between Matt Smith and Emma Darcy. They passed a lot of information silently. I thought this worked to sell the escalation of tension building up between them in a subtle way. It's a bit tricky because it's hard to tell where they're at different times, but in the end, I think they pulled it off. You can watch as Daemon tries to take control of the situation and steer everything toward war. It makes sense for him. He has a long history with Otto, and he believes that they killed his brother and stole his wife's claim. I think it also comes across that he's starting to see more of Viserys in Rhaenyra than the person he wants her to be. And I liked how the scene with Vermithor worked to highlight the differences in how they were reacting to the situation, and on some level who they are as individuals. There's so much in this episode that matches up with Alicent's journey through episode 9, and I find it really surprising to see how similar Daemon's role is to Otto's. I think it's clear that he wants Rhaenyra to be a dragon in the same way he wanted his brother to be, and it really sets him off to see her favoring her father. When she brought up the prophecy, another thing his brother kept from him, I thought it tracked for the character to explode after what we watched building up. It's a choice to have him choke her rather than express his rage in a different way, but we know he's a violent guy, and that his statement about being capable of depravity was part of the reason she wanted him on her side. And that's not to say that she thought he was capable of doing something like this to her, because I think when you watch her reaction, you can see that she is shocked at it. And so I think that will make it interesting to see how things change between them now that we've reached this point. My takeaway from this story was never that it was about picking one side over the other. I've never considered myself a supporter of Team Black or Team Green. Sure, Rhaenyra has the better claim, and the characters on her side are more interesting in the book, but it always seemed like a tragic tale of how everyone suffers when powerful people don't get what they think they deserve. The system they're born into dictates that something like this is inevitable, and yet the power involved is so great that it still draws people to do things they might not do otherwise in an attempt to possess it. Also, it is generational. The kids get pulled right into it. They don't really have a choice. It happened to Viserys and Rhaenys. It happened to Rhaenyra and Alicent, and now we see that being passed down to the next generation. The show has managed to add to that in its first season. It's been able to humanize the characters who bring all of this fire and blood into the world. They end the season with the death of a child who is only trying to do right by his mother and his family. He was born into this rather than choosing this. As I mentioned at the beginning, he's about the same age as Rhaenyra and Alicent were when they were in the Godswood reading that history book about Nymeria that the page on the bridge came from, back when she was still her father's cupbearer before she became heir, and before Alicent's father sent her to comfort the king in his chambers after Emma's death. They were born into this system too. The monarchy that is backed up by the threat of violence from their dragons that keeps them in a position of power above everyone else, and the patriarchy that ensures that their role as women is limited to what others are willing to grant them, and it all amounts to a recipe for disaster. And again, I liked how they split these two episodes to show how that played out on both sides. We got to see Otto and Daemon both try to take control and escalate their respective situations, and Alicent and Rhaenyra trying to find a peaceful solution. There was a brief moment where you could imagine that cooler heads might prevail, a glimmer of hope that you might be able to fix a broken system by installing the right ruler. Rhaenyra sheds a tear when she sees the page and remembers that the 14-year-old laying in the grass next to the heart tree is still inside her, and that part of Alicent is still in there too. What's tragic is that as viewers, we know that while that's probably true, they've been absorbed into the system that created them. As sincere as the gesture and the feeling might have been, it was still a move from someone who's playing the game. And maybe there was a time when they could have found a way to avoid war, but that time passed when Luke died. It's an interesting thought to end a season on, and I think that's a great place to leave things. Let me know in the comments what you thought about this episode and what you thought about the first season in general. I had my issues, which I stand by, but it was a lot of fun, and there were some real high points in this season. So not perfect, but I'm looking forward to more. How are you feeling about 3 more seasons? And what are you gonna do until 2024 when we get more episodes? Please like this video if you enjoyed it. Please subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, and thanks for watching. I'll talk to you soon.